The character of Levitt, he is sort of the first man to suffer extensive sort of mental or emotional damage from his experience of the war. And so he's depicted as kind of losing his grasp of what's important. For him, it was picking up his books. So they've just been shelled, and their dugout is in complete chaos, disarray, and they're just sort of taking stock of what happened. And then Levitt is sort of clinging to his book, trying to pile them up, and he kind of is losing it. So he says, "Would you please not put them there?" said Levitt. "I'm doing my best to clean things up and get this place in order. You fellows just keep knocking everything down and putting things where they don't belong. Leave my books alone." There was an edge of craziness in his voice that sounded dangerous. And then Rodwell ends up slapping him in the face. And then Levitt runs and leaves. And then a couple pages later, we have the result of that. So page 117, Robert does not want Levitt to be in charge of any men. He recognizes that Levitt is no longer in sort of composed mind anymore. It was disconcerting. And so Robert recognizes that Levitt is no longer capable of sort of rational thinking. He is suffering from shock, shell shock. Eventually, Levitt will be placed amongst on flat cars. So this is on page 134 in the middle. There they put Levitt on one of the flat cars with a number of men who had been wounded. Levitt was the only one sitting up. The books were piled beside him, scorched almost beyond recognition. Certainly they would never be read again. So he's going off to sort of rest, right? But he is not the wounded, so he's not physically wounded. Mentally or emotionally, Levitt has, he's no longer sort of in touch with reality. So he has his books beside him. They're burnt beyond recognition. So he's no longer, he's suffering from shell shock pretty much, right? So he's psychologically sort of traumatized from the events that occurred. And he's clinging onto these books because they're symbols for him, right? They were symbols of order and system and reason. And here he has experienced something that defied his sense of reason, and it was pure chaos, right? So he is going off to rest and recuperate, probably at one of those convalescent homes as well. The chaos itself is conveyed for Robert in particular when he is put in charge of sort of the crater, right? So he is put in charge of putting another mortar, so another sort of missile launcher, in the crater, and his company commander, Captain Leather, who seems a little bit out of touch with what's really going on, commands Robert to go lead a group of men to this giant crater, and then set their gun beds in there. And then Robert, this is on page 116, he can't really say anything against this plan because this is a senior officer talking to him, so Captain Leather has more power. He's higher up on that hierarchy than Robert, so Robert just is, he says he felt constrained to silence, so he can't really go against his orders. That would be sort of treasonish, or treason, traitorish behavior, right? So you can't be going against your commanding officer. But Robert felt he was being condemned to death, right? Because you can't just enter into sort of new territory, and Robert knew that this was a really dangerous mission, so he felt like Captain Leather was just sending him out to meet his death, right? With no consideration of his life or the men's lives. So this sort of speaks to the cruelty, the coldness, the calculatedness of the senior officers who really did not take into account that they were sending, actual humans, that these were lives on the line. All they cared about was just advancing their mission. It was all sort of down on paper, a plan or a strategy that they were trying to get, um, trying to accomplish, right? It didn't matter how many lives were lost as long as they completed their mission. So it is very sort of detached from the actual human lives that were being uh, sacrificed in order to sort of just gain a little bit of land. So the hierarchy of the military system is shown through Captain Leather, who is very sort of inconsiderate of the risks involved, and he's willing to send soldiers out to meet their death as long as his strategy or his plan is met. So he doesn't really care about Robert's life or any of the other men. For him, it's just about putting this scheme together, his plan to set the guns. That's all that matters to him. And he's probably taking his orders from higher up still, right? So it's the higher you go up on this hierarchy, the less sort of involved you are with the day-to-day realities of death. Robert's right on the front lines, so he's the one leading the men, and he sees the death and chaos all around him. So amidst this chaos and madness, Robert is set in charge of putting in some gun beds in this giant crater, and he describes Captain Leather on page 119 as having no sense of kind of reality of what this actually would mean, this to go through with this mission. And it says, here was the all too familiar case of an officer, Captain Leather, standing to the rear with a map and a theoretical crater in his mind and making use of it in a fine imaginative way that had nothing to do with the facts. Robert is put in charge of this mission to cross this crater, and they're very close to enemy lines. So Robert was in charge of this mission, and it turns out to be somewhat of a disaster. Although Robert, we see him leading the men effectively in this instance. So he is assisted by Corporal Bates and the rest of the men. So all together, they have to sort of cross across this crater and then plant their sort of missile launchers on the other side, nearest the German trenches. And then what ensues is a gas attack, but it turns out that the men aren't issued gas masks. So there's moments of panic while Robert and Corporal Bates and the other men are being sort of, there's gas everywhere and they don't know what to do because they aren't issued masks. So this also speaks to the cruelty of the military system and the fact that they're not preparing these men with adequate arsenal, right? So you had to buy your own gun, you had to supply your own gas mask. They weren't sort of even considering preserving the lives of the men, right? So they're not even issuing them basic things that would be necessities. So it was all up to you to sort of, your life was in your hands, but it wasn't really. It was sort of the military system was sort of taking advantage of these men, and it didn't really matter whether they lived or died. So it was just using them as tools. And then we have a description of complete chaos, this nightmarish scene where all the men are in this crater trench where there's water at the bottom, and they're getting a gas attack, and there's only one gas mask between all of them, so they had to, Robert had to use force and assert his authority and give the gas mask to the one man who was wounded, who had broken his leg on the fall down into the crater. So in this moment of panic-strickenness, the men are fighting one another, and it's all sort of just complete chaos, right? Every man for himself kind of thing. Robert thinks rationally, gives the gas mask to the wounded soldier, and then instructs the other men to urinate on their handkerchiefs. And then he remembers this lesson, right, from his childhood, where if you had ammonia, it would cancel out the chlorine gas attack, so he could save the lives of the men this way. And this whole time they're being watched by the German sniper, right? So they identified on the other side there is this young man who is watching them, and he has yet to shoot them. For some reason, this German sniper has not shot them. He's just watching them. So the men are stuck lying on the ground for like up to 3 hours, where they have this frozen piece of handkerchief covered with urine on their faces, trying to protect themselves from the gas attack. And then after 3 hours, Robert sort of takes the initiative to roll over and then checks the scene, and then this is when he sees the German soldier staring right at them. And he could see that this was a very young man, so maybe 18, he said. So just another young man, just like them. Like you can remember that scene previously where Taffler said it's just one David against another. This is another indication that, the other side were just young men just like they were. So it's just a group of, another 18-year-old from Germany who is on the enemy side. So he was just like a man like you, taking orders from above, risking his life for something that maybe he didn't believe in either. So at a certain point you become, like Robert does, sort of disillusioned, and the enemy is not this overarching, tyrannical, leader. It's just another man just like you who's stuck in this horrible situation. And then this young German officer who is watching them, he hasn't made any moves to shoot them. And then he seemingly allows them to get up one by one and go back over the edge, so they don't follow through on their complete mission. They just want to get out at this point with their lives. And then at the end, there is a moment of chaos again, where Robert ends up shooting the German who has let them go, and he acted sort of almost instinctively using his gun, and this is the first human fatality that Robert has sort of initiated. So this is the first person he's killed during war, and it's something that's haunting to him. And then we have that image of the birds singing in the background. So the birds seem once again associated with death. And Robert has killed this young German soldier, thinking that maybe he was going to get shot at the very end, but then it turns out that this young man had just been reaching for his binoculars, and he had a rifle or a sniper beside him, but he didn't use it. And then Robert had accidentally, just in this moment of chaos, killed the German, even though he was unarmed, or he chose not to shoot. So Robert ended up killing a guy who was being kind, doing a kind gesture towards Robert and the other men. And then the lasting image of this scene, page 131, is the birds singing and Robert listening to this note, the sadness of this bird's song. And then it says, it sang, and sang, till Robert rose and walked away. The sound of it would haunt him to the day he died.